What the hell was that? Green barked, scrambling to his feet. We're going to die here, Alicia whimpered, burying her face in her mother's shoulder. No one's dying. Green snapped, though his voice betrayed his own fear. He pounded on the emergency button again, his frustration boiling over. Come on. Someone has to hear us. But the button yielded nothing, just an eerie hum of machinery that sounded far from welcoming. Darren, his chest heaving with panic, tried to steady himself. We can't just wait for help. We need to do something. Like what? Mrs. Harper retorted, her voice sharp with anxiety. There's no way out. As if to challenge her statement, the elevator's ceiling panel creaked. The sound was subtle at first but grew louder, like footsteps pressing down on the metal. The group froze, their eyes darting upward. Is someone up there? Darren whispered. Green raised his flashlight, aiming the beam at the ceiling. The panel shifted slightly, as though something, or someone, was on top of the elevator car. A low, guttural groan reverberated through the walls, and this time, it wasn't mechanical. It was primal, almost human. I don't think we're alone, Green muttered, his voice barely audible. The elevator shook again, but this time the lights flickered on and stayed. The sudden brightness was blinding after the prolonged darkness. But the relief was short-lived. On the reflective surface of the elevator doors, they saw something that made their blood run cold. Handprints. Dozens of them, smeared and overlapping, as though countless hands had been pressed against the inside of the doors. Some were small, almost childlike, while others were large and jagged, with unnaturally long fingers. Alicia let out a strangled cry, and Mrs. Harper turned her daughter's face away from the sight. Darren stared, paralyzed, while Green stepped forward cautiously, his flashlight trembling in his grip. This can't be real, Green said, his voice hollow. He reached out tentatively, his fingers brushing the handprints. They smudged slightly under his touch, leaving behind dark, greasy streaks. Don't touch it. Darren warned, pulling Green back. You don't know what that is. Before anyone could respond, the temperature plummeted even further. Their breath became visible in the frigid air, curling like smoke. A sudden, deafening clang rang out, as if something massive had struck the elevator from above. The sound reverberated through the walls, shaking the car violently. Green stumbled backward, and the flashlight slipped from his hands, its beam dancing erratically across the floor. Darren snatched it up and pointed it toward the ceiling. The access panel was now ajar, swinging slightly as though it had been pushed open from the outside. Someone's out there, Darren hissed, his voice trembling. Or something. Mrs. Harper, clutching Alicia, snapped, this is insane. We need to get out of here now. Darren scanned the panel with the flashlight, dread pooling in his stomach. And go where? Into the shaft. You've seen the handprints. What if? A loud, metallic screech cut him off. The elevator doors groaned as they began to part, but instead of revealing another floor, there was only a solid brick wall. The sight defied logic, and the group stared in horror as the gap widened, revealing faint scratches etched into the bricks. Words began to take shape in the dim light, scrawled in a desperate, uneven hand. You're next. Alicia screamed, and Mrs. Harper pulled her closer, her own face pale with terror. Darren stumbled back, his legs threatening to give out. This isn't real. This can't be real. Green, shaking himself from his stupor, grabbed Darren's shoulder. We need to climb out. Now. Darren hesitated, but the growing sense of dread left him with little choice. He nodded, and together they positioned themselves beneath the open ceiling panel. Green braced himself against the wall and hoisted Darren upward. The young man's heart raced as he gripped the edge of the opening and pulled himself through. The shaft was a dark, claustrophobic space. Dust filled the air, and the faint hum of the building's machinery buzzed in his ears. He turned to help Green through the panel when he caught sight of something in the shadows above, a figure, barely visible, its outline distorted and flickering as though it wasn't fully solid. Darren froze, his breath hitching. The figure turned its head slowly, its glowing, hollow eyes locking onto him. "Move!" Green shouted from below, breaking Darren's trance. "Get moving!" Darren scrambled upward, his hands shaking as he grabbed the cables running along the shaft. The others followed, climbing desperately in a bid to escape. But the figure above began to descend, its movements jerky and unnatural. A guttural growl echoed through the shaft, growing louder with each passing second. Darren's hands burned as he gripped the elevator cables, hoisting himself higher with every ounce of strength he could muster. The figure's guttural growls grew louder, echoing in the narrow shaft. Behind him, Green followed closely, his jaw clenched as he helped Mrs. Harper and Alicia ascend. The young girl was sobbing, her small hands clutching her mother's arm as though letting go would doom them all. "Don't look down!" Green barked, his voice trembling despite his best effort to remain calm. But Darren couldn't help himself. He glanced downward and immediately wished he hadn't. The figure was no longer descending at a slow, jerky pace, it was surging toward them, its hollow eyes glowing with an unnatural light. The closer it got, the more Darren could see its twisted form, gaunt, elongated limbs and a mouth that stretched impossibly wide, revealing jagged, yellowed teeth. "Climb faster!" Darren shouted, his voice breaking. He looked up, his heart sinking when he realized the end of the shaft was still a considerable distance away. Above them was a service platform, a metal grate that offered a sliver of hope. "Head for the platform!" Green shouted, his hand gripping Darren's ankle to push him upward. "Go! Now!" Darren's arms screamed in protest as he pulled himself higher, his palms slick with sweat. The sound of the creature's growls mixed with the creak of the cables, creating a cacophony of terror. Behind him, Alicia let out a shriek as her foot slipped, causing her to dangle precariously. "I've got you!" Mrs. Harper cried, gripping her daughter tightly. Green scrambled to steady them, his movements frantic. Darren reached the platform and hauled himself onto the metal grate. The relief was short-lived as he turned to see the others struggling. He extended a hand, pulling Alicia up first before helping Mrs. Harper. Green was next, but just as he reached for Darren's hand, the creature's clawed fingers wrapped around his ankle. "No!" Green bellowed, kicking violently. The creature's grip was like a vice, its inhuman strength nearly pulling him off the platform. Darren grabbed Green's arm and pulled with all his might, his muscles straining against the creature's hold. "Help him!" Darren shouted, his voice raw with desperation. Mrs. Harper joined in, grabbing Green's other arm, while Alicia clung to her mother, crying hysterically. With a final, guttural scream, Green managed to kick free, the creature's claws leaving deep gashes in his leg. The group collapsed onto the platform, their chests heaving as they struggled to catch their breath. But the reprieve was fleeting. The creature let out a deafening roar, its hollow eyes fixed on the platform. It began climbing the cables again, its movements more aggressive, more determined. "We can't stay here!" Darren yelled, scanning their surroundings. A maintenance ladder was bolted to the wall, leading to an access hatch above. "There! We have to climb!" Green nodded, wincing as he stood. Blood seeped through the torn fabric of his pant leg, but he waved off Mrs. Harper's concern. "I'm fine. Let's move." One by one, they ascended the ladder, the hatch looming closer. Darren reached it first, gripping the handle and twisting it with all his strength. It didn't budge. "It's locked," he shouted, panic rising in his chest. He pounded on the metal, hoping someone on the other side would hear. The creature let out another roar, its gnarled hands gripping the edge of the platform. It pulled itself up, its grotesque form illuminated by the faint light in the shaft. Darren's mind raced as he scanned the hatch. There was a small release mechanism, but it was rusted and unyielding. Hold it off, he shouted over his shoulder, his fingers fumbling with the mechanism. Green grabbed a loose pipe from the platform and swung it at the creature as it lunged toward them. The metal connected with a sickening crunch, but the creature barely flinched. Its glowing eyes burned with fury as it swiped at Green, knocking him back against the wall. "Hurry!" Mrs. Harper screamed, shielding Alicia with her body. Darren's hands were slick with sweat, but he refused to give up. With a desperate cry, he slammed the flashlight against the release mechanism. The rusted metal gave way, and the hatch creaked open. A rush of fresh air hit Darren's face, filling him with a fleeting sense of hope. "It's open." "Go, go," he yelled, helping Alicia through the hatch first. Mrs. Harper followed, then Green, who was limping heavily. The creature let out a shriek of rage as Darren pulled himself through, slamming the hatch shut behind him. They found themselves in an old maintenance room, dimly lit and filled with rusted tools and machinery. Green collapsed against the wall, his face pale as he pressed a hand against his bleeding leg. Is it over?" Alicia whispered, her voice trembling. The answer came in the form of a deafening crash. The hatch buckled under the creature's weight, its claws tearing through the metal. Darren grabbed a heavy wrench from a nearby workbench, his hands shaking. "It's not over," he said grimly. "But it will be." The hatch groaned under the relentless pounding. Each strike echoed through the small maintenance room, sending waves of terror through the group. Darren's knuckles whitened around the wrench, his eyes darting toward Green, who was too injured to stand. "Barricade it!" Darren shouted, grabbing a nearby shelving unit. Mrs. Harper jumped into action, her maternal instinct overriding her fear. Together, they pushed the heavy shelves over the hatch, the tools and equipment clattering to the floor. "Is it strong enough?" Mrs. Harper asked, her voice trembling as she pulled Alicia closer. The answer came in the form of another deafening crash. The metal hatch buckled further, the creature's clawed hand tearing through the opening. It let out a guttural snarl, its glowing eyes burning with rage as it pushed against the makeshift barricade. "No!" Alicia screamed, burying her face in her mother's chest. Green gritted his teeth, struggling to his feet despite the pain. "We can't keep running from this thing. We've got to fight back." Darren nodded, his resolve hardening. "You're right. It's either us or it." He scanned the room, his eyes landing on a fire extinguisher mounted on the wall. He grabbed it, formulating a desperate plan. "When I say now, pull Alicia back and get ready to move." Mrs. Harper hesitated but nodded. Her hands trembled as she tightened her grip on Alicia. "Just, come back, okay?" Darren didn't respond. He couldn't make promises he wasn't sure he could keep. With a final, earth-shaking crash, the creature burst through the barricade, scattering debris across the room. It lunged forward, its elongated limbs stretching unnaturally as it closed the distance. "Now!" Darren shouted, pulling the pin on the fire extinguisher. A plume of white foam erupted, engulfing the creature's face. It recoiled with a deafening screech, clawing at its own head in a frenzy. Darren didn't waste a second, swinging the wrench with all his strength. The metal connected with a sickening crunch, sending the creature staggering backward. "Go! Get out of here!" Darren yelled over his shoulder as Green grabbed Mrs. Harper and Alicia, leading them toward a narrow exit on the far side of the room. The creature recovered quickly, its glowing eyes locking onto Darren with a newfound fury. It lunged, swiping at him with claws that narrowly missed his chest. Darren ducked, rolling to the side as he swung the wrench again, this time connecting with its leg. The creature faltered, its movements jerky and disjointed, but it showed no signs of stopping. Darren's arms burned with exhaustion, but he refused to back down. "You're not taking us," he growled through gritted teeth. The creature let out a guttural snarl, lunging once more. Darren sidestepped, grabbing a length of frayed electrical cable from the floor. He looped it around the creature's neck, pulling with all his strength. The creature thrashed violently, its claws raking at the air as it let out a high-pitched wail. "Hold on, Darren." Green's voice cut through the chaos. He limped toward Darren, dragging a large metal pipe. With a determined cry, he swung it with all his might, striking the creature's head. The impact sent it crashing to the ground, its body convulsing as an unearthly screech filled the room. Darren tightened the cable, his muscles screaming in protest. The creature's movement slowed, its glowing eyes dimming as it let out one final, shuddering breath. Then, with a deafening silence, it went still. Darren collapsed to his knees, gasping for air. Green dropped the pipe, his shoulders slumping as the adrenaline drained from his body. "Is it dead?" Mrs. Harper's voice trembled as she peeked around the corner, clutching Alicia protectively. "I don't know," Darren admitted, his chest heaving. He released the cable, warily stepping back from the creature's motionless form. "But we're not sticking around to find out." The group emerged from the maintenance room, the cool night air hitting their faces like a blessing. Emergency lights illuminated the parking garage, their flickering glow casting eerie shadows across the empty space. "Is everyone okay?" Darren asked, his voice hoarse. Mrs. Harper nodded, holding Alicia close. "We're alive. That's all that matters." Green leaned heavily against a nearby pillar, his injured leg still bleeding but his expression resolute. "We need to call someone. The police, the fire department, anyone who can seal that place off." Darren nodded, pulling his phone from his pocket. His hands shook as he dialed 911, relaying their harrowing experience to the operator. As they waited for help to arrive, Alicia looked up at her mother, her small voice breaking the silence. "Is the monster gone?" Mrs. Harper brushed a strand of hair from her daughter's face, her voice steady despite the tears in her eyes. "It's gone, baby. It can't hurt us anymore." In the weeks that followed, the ordeal became a defining moment for all of them. Darren, once a timid and self-doubting man, found a newfound sense of confidence. He began to believe in his ability to protect and lead, a change that radiated in his interactions with others. Mrs. Harper grew closer to Alicia, her strict demeanor softening as she realized the fragility of life. She made a conscious effort to balance discipline with warmth, fostering a stronger bond with her daughter. As for Green, the near-death experience reinforced his commitment to his family and community. He became an advocate for safety measures in public spaces, ensuring that no one else would have to face what they had endured. Though the memory of the haunted elevator lingered, it served as a reminder of their resilience and the strength they found in each other. Together, they had faced the unimaginable, and they had survived. Thank you for joining us on this chilling ride. If you enjoyed the story, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe to the channel for more gripping tales. And hey, don't stop here, check out the other thrilling videos appearing on your screen right now. Each one is packed with suspense, drama, and unforgettable moments. See you in the next story.